Hello, welcome everyone to the Decolonizing International Relations Conference, but then also specifically to the Decolonizing International Relations 101 panel. I'm going to be the moderator for this event, Jeremiah Anthony. With us today, we have a great roster. I'm not going to be humble about that. I'm telling you the truth. We have Professor Ayesha Jalal from the Fletcher School and Tufts University, Professor Chris Manjapra from Tufts University, and then Professor Jayita Sarkar from Boston University. So I have to confess, this is somewhat of a dream of mine to be a fly on the wall for this conversation and with these people. I think that if genius wasn't a word in the English language, it would be invented for these people, both together and individually. They warrant it and then some. But moreover, I think that you all are going to be a key part of this conversation. So how this panel is going to work is I have a few questions just to warm everyone up, just to get us on the right track. And then from there, I'm really just going to open it up to the audience. Please put your questions in the chat. If you have any questions you'd like to ask anonymously, just please message Collude. If you know how to do that, it's pretty simple. You just scroll through the participants list on the chat and then message Collude. She'll keep it anonymous and direct it to me, and we'll ask it without attribution. And most of all, really challenge yourselves in this conversation. Ask all the questions, stump us, or stump the panelists. With that, I'd like to ask Professor Jalal, Professor Manjapra, and then Professor Sarkar to just provide a brief introduction of who they are and what they do.
Well, I'm the Mary Richardson Professor of History at Tufts University, and I also have an appointment at the Fletcher School, and I specialize in South Asia in the main.
Hello, I'm Chris Manjapra. I am an Associate Professor of History at Tufts, as well as the Chair of the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora. My interests range across various continents, including South Asia, Europe, the Black Atlantic, and I'm especially interested in colonialism in comparative and global perspective.
Hello, everybody. A very good morning. My name is Jayita Sarkar. I am an assistant professor at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies. My specialization is in diplomatic and political history, specifically South Asia, Second World War onward. And now I'm working on a new project on the connected histories of partitions from 1900 to 1980s. And I think I'll be talking a little bit about that at some point in this conversation. So looking forward to where the conversation takes.
So since this is the first panel of the day, please allow me to ask you a very general question and take it however you want. What is decolonization? And then what does decolonizing international relations entail?
Who is the question to? To all of us?
This is to everyone. This is everyone.
You want us to respond? I mean, I think we can't all be speaking at the same time, surely.
Sure. Let me start with Professor Sarkar first.
Yeah, good.
Okay, that's a lot of pressure here. So to put it very simply, I would say that decolonization entails the recognition of the significance of colonialism and slavery in creating an unequal system within and across nations, and most importantly, in our everyday lives. And I think it's something I think that we should definitely keep in mind. It's an ongoing process, and that it's not just about a group of nation states becoming independent in the 40s and then again in the 60s, and then we don't know what happened, right? So I think it's important. For my work, I always remind my students it is an ongoing process, something to keep in mind. Your second question is how to decolonize IR. I am a historian, but I teach in a policy school. And so, most of my students are not historians. So this is something that I think a lot about. And I think it's important to understand the role of ideas. And in this effort to decolonize IR, for example, think about the importance of nation states. It's so important in international relations theories. But the moment you look at how nation states emerge and what is that, why is that the preferred model? How did that emerge to become the preferred model? Going back to the interwar years primarily, we can get a sense of how this model was chosen, for example. So I think to put it very simply in terms of broad ideas, I think the role of ideas really matters. So perhaps some systematic engagement with intellectual history by IR scholars. And I know I'm asking for a lot here, but that could be an important way to think about it. And the second way to decolonize IR is a really serious engagement with history. And I read a lot of political science scholarship where there is, the person has gone to the archives and has really delved deep. But I think the perspective is really case studies, right? As a very deductive understanding of finding this one document that's going to substantiate this theory or this hypothesis. But I don't think that's enough from the perspective of this broad goal of decolonizing IR. So from that perspective, understanding processes over just outcomes. And I think history can show a lot of that to scholars of international relations. And I know I'm speaking from an outsider's perspective, but an outsider who has always engaged with IR scholarship with an open mind in some ways because of the institution I'm in. So that would be my initial comments to begin the conversation.
And Professor Jalal, do you have any thoughts about this as well?
Yes, well, I should hope so. Decolonization typically is rather reductively seen as political decolonization, the freeing of a former colony. But actually, political decolonization is just, in many ways, a myth, because the structures that underpin a colonial rule generally continue. And so you have the need for economic decolonization. But I think perhaps the most difficult of all, and I think this is something that Jayata Sarkar has touched upon, is the question of the decolonization of the mind, which really sort of persists to this day. And I think that's at the core of, I think, even your enterprise of decolonizing IR. I mean, IR also has a particular history. I mean, one can talk about IR as a discipline and what it should be, but IR has had a peculiar history that has been intrinsically connected with a global post-war order, a post-Second World War order, which is designed to uphold structures of power that continue many of the same inequities for which colonialism is condemned and for which people sought release. So in fact, IR justifies many of those structures, which is why the need to decolonize it is not just urgent, but is long overdue.
And then Professor Manjapra, what are your thoughts about this?
Thank you. And I appreciate being on this panel with such insightful colleagues. And I think we'll have a chance to speak later about, in more detail, the project of DIR at Fletcher, which must be celebrated. I know it's been a multi-year project, and it's very encouraging to see. I think I'm echoing what has been said. I think of decolonization as the counter-history of colonialism. I think of colonialism as an ongoing process or set of forces that I think of as really emerging in the 1400s. Not that there was not colonialism before then, but there were new kinds of colonialism that emerged. And decolonization is therefore the centuries-long ongoing forms of contradiction to this history that we're speaking of. When we think of it slightly differently, and maybe just turning the tables a bit, we might say that colonialism itself can better be understood as the ongoing, incomplete, and ultimately unsuccessful attempt to eliminate or eradicate the durability of decolonizing responses. So in fact, I would propose that it is decolonization that is the historical driver over the centuries of what we might call the early modern to the modern period. And colonialism is very much the imperfect and the failed ongoing attempts to rule over or contain or ultimately eliminate this kind of permanent decolonizing impulse. And so that raises a number of questions, which I think we are already discussing. How do we understand that durable decolonizing impulse? And I respond very much in line with my co-panelists in recognizing that we're not just talking about the realm of the political, we're also very much thinking about the realm of the intellectual, or if we can even expand that, what I like to think of as the realm of spirit, as meaning the human spirit, or even the spirit that goes beyond human being to being more generally, thinking about environmental beings, ecological beings, animal beings, all of which I believe participate in this ongoing impulse of decolonization. Now, one last word about decolonization in IR. My sense, one way of framing this question is to recognize that the university and its disciplines are founded upon epistemes, or they're founded upon categories for how we recognize what exists and what is knowledge. And these categories also put into the shadows a variety of ways of knowing, a variety of expressions of experiences that are not contained in the established epistemological categories. And so for me, when we're talking about decolonizing IR, we're also having a conversation necessarily about epistemology, about what are our categories to recognize what is the subject matter for IR, and how do we disrupt those categories? How do we interrupt and disrupt those categories so that that which is in the shadows can be brought into the light?
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Now we're gonna go a little bit from general into specific, and later we'll get very specific. But right now, let's talk about academia. So in the West, especially in America, academia is often referred to as the ivory tower. Ivory doesn't come from the West. And I mean that metaphorically and literally. How do we decolonize the ivory tower of academia? And first, could Professor Jalal, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, the question is exactly what Chris Manjapra has just said, that you have to question the presumptions that underpin epistemologies that frame the debate on IR, for one thing. And I mean, if that is, I mean, because the academy is huge, so I will be specific on the IR issue. So I think that one has to sort of really expose the sort of presumptions that underpin IR, which is to justify certain forms of, incomplete decolonizations, which sort of perpetuate certain kinds of uneven processes of power at the economic level or at the intellectual level. So I think that that's where the real issue is, that there are certain assumptions that the academy makes very self-confidently, which when exposed to a decolonizing mode of analysis and questioning of the epistemologies, if one can call it that, or even disaggregating those epistemologies, I mean, you show their contradictions and the extent to which they turn on themselves. So I think that's basically what I would say is the ivory tower of the academy, which is to sort of propose a rather methodological view of the world, which is just not true, which is a stretch removed from the reality. But there are certain presumptions that are projected on by the academy, which I think when exposed to questioning of the kind that Chris Manjapra is referring to, exposes those epistemologies on which the academy projects itself.
Then Professor Sarkar, could you respond to that?
Yes, I completely agree with what Professor Jalal and Professor Manjapra had said earlier. And that is in terms of, how to decolonize the ivory tower of academia, we need to question the forms of power, right? In the sense that what is knowledge? What is data? What kinds of knowledge matter more than others? What kinds of data and methodology count more than others? And this we can get into from the abstract to the more more tangible, like what gets published where, right? Which is exactly a sign of what counts as good sound knowledge, pushing the discipline of IR forward, and then go back from there. Why is it that? Why is it so, right? And to try to really disentangle those forms of power. And the other is a question of access, right? The ivory tower of academia also has a question of varieties of access, which is really the outcome of hierarchies of power. And so to question and understand where it's coming from, I think recognizing the invisible structures of power having tangible impact in terms of what is knowledge, what forms of knowledge matter more than others, what methodologies count more than others, where fieldwork counts more than others. Archives, for example, there's a written form and then there is a non-written form, right? There is this whole hierarchy of data that matters. To question that, to go back from there, and I think it requires a lot of work at the individual level for all of us. So not just the collective, this conversation, but then going back into our own work and asking, just going back. It's just a lot of reverse engineering in terms of the ideas that I'm talking about here. So that would be my 2 pence on decolonizing the ivory tower of academia.
Then Professor Manjapra, I'd love to hear what you think about this.
Yes, I agree, and I feel that what often happens in the academy is a particular way of relating the part to the whole, by which I mean the categories that are normalized and accepted, which are, by the way, the product of situated individuals. Historically, we're talking about men, and we're talking about cis men, and we're talking about white cis men who have developed, epistemology to describe the world. The irony or the tension here is that, of course, that had to be a particular situated way of seeing things. However, the academy makes it such that these categories appear to be, or parade themselves, if you like, as being universal. So the problem that we seem to be dealing with continuously is how parts tend to overrepresent themselves as wholes. And that takes place politically, but that takes place conceptually. And I think that's an interesting and useful way of thinking about what is needed in the academy. So at that level, we might say that by opening up the academy to scholars who speak from different situated locations and have access to different understandings of what it is to be in society, we are able to also open up opportunities for this kind of decolonization. So it's both a question for me about how curricula change and how categories change, how we move from being siloed in our disciplines to being more interdisciplinary. But that must go along, I believe, with also the transformation of who are the knowers, who are the instructors, who are the researchers. And to bring this to Tufts and to Fletcher, to bring it home, I do believe that Fletcher has some work to do in terms of representing a more variegated set of experiences amongst its professoriate. How can there be a decolonization of the curriculum with even that basic step? Given that I think this problem of how parts tend to parade themselves as wholes is almost an endemic issue within academe, that we have a problem disrupting unless we have that necessary diversity in the instructional group.
Wonderful. And I'm actually seeing some thumbs up and nonverbal reactions from Fletcher professors. So I think that you have many allies in that thought, both in and outside of Fletcher. I wanted to actually double up on you, Professor Manjapra. There's a question that came from Leaf, and I think was also asked by Delia, but could you please give any further thought on how decolonizing IR involves a type of permanent decolonization of thought?
I think so. Maybe I just need to clarify. Thanks for the question. By permanent decolonization, I think I used that term, I meant to really say ongoing, and I think that's what Professor Sarkar was also getting at, as well as Professor Jalal, that we're looking at long-term processes of resistance and response to oppression and to colonial oppression. And in that sense, it's a long game. And I think, I might not be responding directly to your question, but I'll just point to something that I find very important. I would say that I used to be of the mind that the study of decolonization is the study of events. And, for example, resistance movements, particular resistance movements, which it is partly, but inherently, naturally, when we only study decolonization in those terms, events have an end. And you can always ask the question, well, is the world any different now than it was, in the 19th century when there were so many decolonizing movements, or in the 20th century? And we might go down the wrong road in a certain sense of understanding what decolonization means. When I'm pointing to the permanent nature of decolonization, I mean that decolonization is both an event, but it is a structure as well. It's a structure of how the world works, and so it is a permanent feature. It is ongoing and unending in that sense. So I think that's maybe a way I can put the question back onto you, is to ask, what would the next step in the decolonizing project for IR look like, understanding that it's not going to be all at once. It's not going to be one event and then it's resolved, but we're talking about something that is truly an ongoing and permanent feature of how academia works and how our world also works.
I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to just take Professor Manjapra's question and direct it to Professor Sarkar. What is the next step?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, that's an excellent question. It is an open-ended question. In many ways, the audience to also chime in. Perhaps I could combine my answer with also the question in decolonization of IR in practice, which is the segue to perhaps the next segment of this conversation. And I tend to think that, as academics, we don't have a lot of power, but we also have a lot of power because we have our students in the classroom, and they are the next generation. And I think Professor Manjapra did refer to in terms of decolonizing IR in terms of the curriculum. So there are a lot of things that I tend to do in my classroom, and I think most of us do in our own ways, is to discuss the topics, but at the same time discuss what is invisible, what is not there in the scholarship, whether it's the historiography or whether it's a certain kind of IR scholarship. I tend to teach courses on nuclear politics, which is another hat that I wear, and that is notorious for the kinds of conversations we are having about, IR. If you just look at deterrence, oh, good Lord, right? So there is so much conversations that can happen, which is about what is left out in the scholarship and why. It's a similar line of argument that I made before when I was talking about what kinds of knowledge matters and why, and just go back from there, recognize the structures of power. Just the same thing in the classroom. I find it really hard to find good scholarship on effects of nuclear testing in the Nevada test site, for example, because the victims are Native Americans. There is not, and most of the studies are technical, or they are not, not amenable to use in the classroom for undergraduates. And the question is, why is that the case? right? But then we have so much undergraduate friendly work on nuclear deterrence, right? I mean, everybody knows about second strike and survivability and all of that. That tells us something in terms of certain spaces in our specific areas of specialization that could use new thought, that could use new perspective. So I think the next step is many ways that most of us, I think all the panelists here definitely undertake, given my knowledge of their work, is that to discuss the invisibilities in our own areas of work in the classroom, so our students understand. So when they are picking research topic, whether it's their thesis, term paper, master's thesis, dissertation, they are starting the process right there, and we get to be part of that process in our own ways, in a very tangible way. So I think that would be one way of looking at it. But I'm curious to hear what the others have to say.
Well, let's get to it. Professor Jalal, what do you think about that?
About what?
About both Professor Manjapra's question of what comes next.
I mean, I think your original question was how do we decolonize IR? That's what I've understood. I mean, I think I'd like to sort of throw the question. I mean, can IR, if we accept that IR as a particular kind of discipline emerges to justify a particular kind of world order and all the inequities it underpins, can it be decolonized? Or can it only be disaggregated, of the kind of disaggregation that Chris Manjapra talks about, the question of the epistemologies? I question whether it can be decolonized. I think it's meant to perpetuate those inequitable structures. That's what it justifies. And that's the unfortunate thing. We can take it to Fletcher. I mean, I think my colleagues there will agree that, I mean, there's a dire need at Fletcher to humanize the curriculum a lot more. It's heavily security oriented. And I think that's what students think they're there for. They don't really want to understand the complexities of the world. They want to learn the theories of IR and think that those are more important than the actual realities on the ground. So I do think that I question whether IR is decolonizing.
Professor Manjapra, do you think IR can be decolonized?
I think that's a great question, an important one. I believe that the question both relates to, IR as taught at Tufts University and at the Fletcher School, but also IR as it may be taught at other institutions, and IR more generally as an abstract, as a general endeavor. There may be different answers to these questions depending on which particular site we're looking at. Well, first thing that comes to my mind is that inherent, I believe, in conceptual decolonization is, to pick up a word that Professor Jalal just used, a turn to the human. And even beyond that, I would say a recognition that there are different, to speak with Sylvia Wynter, the Jamaican philosopher, there are different genres of human. There are different varieties of the human. There are also different varieties of the humanities. There's not one humanities, there are many humanities, as there are many forms of the human. And so here we come to the general and the particular. We're often locked in conceptually limiting ourselves to particulars that stand in for supposedly universal forms. And I'm not sure there is one universal form of the human. On the other hand, if we can never ask these kinds of questions within the IR classroom or within the conceptual framework of IR, then we don't have any chance in any case. We don't have any chance to humanize. If the methodologies are insisting on a certain kind of model-based abstract overrepresentation of one particular description of the world. So I don't have a definitive answer, but I would just say that I believe that part of the solution must not only therefore be changing or transforming who is teaching in IR and the kind of situated knowledge that they bring, potentially also thereby the ways that situated scholars who, let's say, come from the Dalit castes in South Asia or from out of the Black Atlantic, or who may be trans, or who may be differently abled or disabled, or indigenous or native, from indigenous or native communities, I can see how having scholars from these perspectives on the faculty will inherently disrupt and create good problems to resolve in terms of how IR needs to be rethought. But then even beyond that, I would think that what happens in the classroom becomes very, very important, because how do we, in our classroom, in our teaching, make the study of the subject matter more human? How do we humanize? That relates to both the subject matter in terms of engaging interdisciplinarily with the humanities, with literature, with ethnography, with anthropology, with the arts. Is that part of the IR curriculum? I think it would have to be if we want to turn towards the human. But then also beyond that, how does the classroom experience become something more than the instructor teaching at the student? How does a different kind of relationship potentially emerge in the classroom itself that may help to address this question? So I suppose that's also a question about pedagogical style, which I think needs to also be on the table. So I'm just adding more questions to the mix as I'm thinking through what was just asked.
I just want to add one thing, though. I mean, I take Chris's point about the need for greater diversity and having more perspectives brought to bear. But I don't think we should make the error of seeing this as somehow between the West or the rest, because the issue of decolonization is not restricted to any one part of the world. I mean, you see people perpetuating certain assumptions who could very much be part of the global South. And I think my frustration lies in precisely the fact that these epistemologies that Chris very rightly wants to question, which I think is the primary concern here, if you are to sort of disaggregate, if not decolonize IR, is that people who are not from the West have imbibed them. So they really are the ones, and that's why we talk about the decolonization of the mind, that it's not enough to have political decolonization. You really need a questioning of ideas that people who were formerly colonized have imbibed and are now using them not just to talk back to those who colonized them, but to also colonize their internal others within their own countries.
And that's very, very true. I want to pivot just a little bit. We're going to stay on the same track, but a little bit different question is, how do you appropriately transform those structures that perpetuate colonization of IR and then position the agency of the individual? And I really want to focus on the individual right now. So Professor Sarkar, do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, and I think it's an excellent question that really builds on Professor Manjapra's earlier point about who is teaching IR, and Professor Jalal's point that she just made about how they're teaching it, right? So that brings to the question of are people who really should be able to question those structures of power because they have been historically at the receiving end of, but they're not, right? They've imbibed it and they're perpetuating it. So I think that the role of the individual is extremely important, especially if you're talking about pedagogy, because we are in front of our students, we are doing our research, we are presenting knowledge already produced to them in a certain way. And I think that it certainly matters how we are presenting information to them, how we are managing the discussion, which is really getting into the details, perhaps not as abstract as you're wanting. But I think the role of the individual is extremely important. Who is teaching IR? But more importantly, how? Professor Jalal just mentioned about just having more diversity is not enough, right? We can have IR scholars of every shape, size, and color who's already talking about hyper quantitative statistical regression modeling, and is not really pushing the conversation forward in terms of any potential for decolonization, because that will not lead to what we are trying to build here. But I'm also wanting to know what others have to say on this. But I believe the role of the individual is extremely important in an abstract and a tangible sense.
Professor Jalal, do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, I think the individual and the context matters. I mean, individuals are not autonomous beings, but they work within a context. So I think that's why this conversation is taking place. I think that many people have decided that the best way to do IR is to stay within, we hear about the realists and the idealists. I mean, as if the world can be divided so neatly. I mean, I think what is wrong with IR is the self-confident presumptions. So, I mean, you can put the best individual, but that individual has to work within certain parameters. I mean, does the academy really allow you to do that? I think that's something, I mean, if you're teaching a course in IR, I mean, is that what you're supposed to be doing? I think because you're told that this is what you're expected to teach. So I think context matters. I think people will have to, I mean, the individual is constrained by the context in which he or she operates. And I think that is why, unless we throw open the question of whether IR's self-confident assumptions are really authentic and should be perpetuated, we're not going to get very far in releasing the individual's full potential.
Wonderful. And I have a question for everyone, but I want to start with Professor Sarkar again on this. Is how do we reconcile the need for diverse scholars with the fact that individuals able to rise to the rank of professor most often come from some sort of privilege, for example, socioeconomic privilege enabling access to higher education? Will academia be by nature always be lacking of certain voices? How do we address this?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I'm so glad we are really diving deep and not just staying at the abstract level, which is extremely important. In the earlier part of the conversation, I was talking about access, right? Recognizing that the ivory tower of academia cannot be decolonized unless we recognize the structures of power. So I think your question relates directly to that. But I would also say that at least, my institution, specifically my school, I would say has been doing lately a good job in terms of being open to various kinds of scholars who are not like the specifically, the people who have been to certain kinds of schools or have come from certain kinds of backgrounds, but really opening up the pool to all kinds of people and picking out the best person based on the way it happens, campus visits, job talks, etc. Right? So, but then that's just one institution and that's just one moment, right? We don't know what would happen in the future. We don't know what the past looked like. Well, I have some sense of what the past looks like. Perhaps not the right time to talk about it. But the idea is that I think it comes from really institutional leadership, recognizing clearly that if we really want to have our students to have the kinds of experience that we want them to have and not just talk about it, then the way to do it is to transforming hiring practices. And some institutions are doing it, but it's imperfect, as I would say. But I don't know if I answered your question fully, but if you can ask me again, perhaps I could try to respond some more.
Sure. Okay. So the full question was a lot of people who'd be beneficial to decolonizing academia. And I think later we'll talk about other institutions and structures as well. But right now, just academia will by nature always, or by nature or practice really, come from more privileged backgrounds. And the people that we need are people from diverse backgrounds and lower socioeconomic backgrounds. How do we get more of those people in there? Can we get more people from diverse backgrounds, from less privileged backgrounds into academia?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think my response did address that in terms of transforming hiring practices and through institutional leadership. At BU, for example, there is this new initiative in terms of for students, for first generation students. So where faculty who are also first generation college graduates are really there for mentorship. It's very new. It happened over the summer and I think early fall. But initiatives like that, if that could be transported to other institutions, or if they already have it expanded, sustain it. A lot of good initiatives run out of steam after the social push for it dissipates. We know this summer has been unique, the summer of 2020 than others, leading to new institutional changes in many places. If it's not there, we need to have it, and if it's there, we need to sustain it. And so the response is really institutional leadership and initiatives to sustain initiatives like the one I mentioned for first generation students. Because students also want to know other people who are just like them, right? It's important, right? So I find myself grew up in India, and all my professors look just like me. But in grad school, things were very different, right? So it's important for our mentorship for our students to make those initiatives available and sustain them. Do not just have them, but sustain them.
Professor Manjapra, could you share your thoughts on this, on how to bring in folks who aren't given positions of power, who aren't given access to higher education, and who don't easily become professors?
Yes, sure. Actually, 2 points I need to respond to. The first is to clarify that I'm aware of a common misunderstanding that often emerges, especially when we start speaking about diversity and individuals. Both terms I find very questionable in terms of their actual salience, because I'm really interested in the analysis of power. And I'm interested in relationalities, by which I mean I'm less focused or concerned about individual, certainly not about individual quotas or census categories, but rather on how in society certain groups are made secure by the rendering vulnerable of other groups. Also, I'm interested in the ways that the overrepresentation of certain groups is intrinsically dependent upon the underrepresentation and in fact, the effacement of other groups. So there are inherent power dynamics that are at work, and we cannot think of this category of the individual without bringing in, I would say, beyond context, really have to bring in power. And what I mean by power is how relative privileging and securitizing and overrepresentation of some depends upon the disproportionate rendering vulnerable and effaced of others. That's a problem, and it's a problem that requires ongoing decolonizing response. I would also say that the responses to this kind of relationality are ethical responses. Ethics is the study of how do we see ourselves clearly. It is a science in that sense, because it is about precision. How do we clearly understand how our society is working? And so for whoever should come into the IR faculty or the university faculty, my hope would be that those individuals would both be able to contribute new situated knowledge as well as ethical clarity in order to prevent the problem of a kind of census-based diversity solution, which is very much in line with the way the university works. So not just Tufts, but we see many universities now in this past period, certainly in 2020, who are waking up to quote unquote DEI. And the problem with that formation on its own is that it does not address equity and ethics, and it's not based upon a power analysis. And that's what I believe we desperately need. Now, I'll say one just quick word about your question about how does this happen in IR. I think we shouldn't forget that IR, like the university, like any social institution, is a field of power. It is a field of mobilization. And therefore, the only way that real change can come is through actual organizing and mobilizing. And I see that that's what the students of DIR are doing. Trust me, if you don't organize, it's not going to come down from below. And if both faculty and students who have this sense that things must change, do not activate themselves and actually speak up against the systems and the establishments that are entrenched, there isn't going to be a meaningful transformation. It will be a more census-based transformation as opposed to truly changing what it means to teach IR. So it's really on us, is all I mean to say. It's not about waiting, can it happen? When will it happen? Will it happen right? Those are not, for me, the questions. The questions are more organizing questions around what steps need to be done in order to change the power dynamics at a small scale or a medium scale, and to keep the pressure on the decision makers or change the decision makers such that things are different. People are held accountable. It's a question of organizing in politics. That's in my perspective.
Wonderful. Professor Jalal, I have a question for you, and then I want to open it up to Professor Sarkar and Professor Manjapra in that order. But reflecting on what Professor Manjapra just said and his earlier thoughts, how do we, not just folks on the panel, but really everyone in the audience and everyone in academia, how do we get outside of the echo chamber of academia and actually move towards decolonizing organizations and institutions that perpetuate colonial ideologies? Can we truly decolonize systems and structures of international institutions that are built on and embedded in colonial thought?
Well, I think, first of all, I think education itself should be a process by which students are really encouraged to think out of the box, to question the categories that they are presented with as truths and as theory, IR theory. You talk to undergrads or even graduate students of how important IR theory is. So I think by making them question the presumptions that underlie it, I think you can begin to start a process of questioning. I think that has played a role in what is happening even at this conference, that students have been made to question some of the presumptions with which they've come. We talk about the nation state. Let's talk about specific categories that are beloved by the IR discipline. We talk about national interest, as if these are gospel truths. It's only when we begin to question how constructed these are and how situated these are that students can do something with them, or at least can gain the courage to do something with them. And I will repeat the fact that the individual can't do much. I think that's why organizing is important. But it is only when you encourage individuals to learn to think out of the box and feel confident about it, or to think beyond their comfort zones, that you can actually, you really need to be able to come out of your comfort zone and think about how other people live and think. That's the kind of education that can instill in students a way of questioning that will bring about a change. It won't happen overnight, but it is a process that should start.
And then Professor Sarkar, I'm going to actually pivot the question just a little bit. Is the way that you would decolonize an academic institution the same way you would decolonize a government institution or other organization, NGOs, international orgs, etc., that work practically in the field of IR?
Yeah, and it's certainly not easy, is what I would say, because as a historian at a policy school, I often get the question as to, why isn't history policy relevant enough? Or why don't policymakers, why do political scientists have to do all this work for policy relevant work? But policy relevant work, quote unquote, in and of itself is about really sustaining the structures of power, right? So the moment you are questioning, which is exactly what all the panelists here are talking about, is that we are teaching students to question the structures of power. Go beyond what is in front of you and try to make sense of why is it the way it is, right? The moment you start doing that, you're not useful to the powerful anymore and you are policy irrelevant, right? And that makes it decolonizing institutions not impossible, but very challenging, right? Because as Professor Jalal had mentioned that, what makes a good IR scholar, right? A graduate student becomes a faculty member and wants to be this good IR scholar and is definitely has to play by those rules. And as a result, is constrained in some way. So imagine the same thing happening at an institution where you probably start as a State Department intern and then you go up the ranks, or you work in a think tank. We know think tank economy is soft money, right? Once again, I'm getting into the details here because it's so challenging to do what you're asking to do. So I tend to focus on what is really within my means as somebody who teaches undergraduates and graduate students. So I can talk to them and I can teach them to think. Well, they are pretty good at thinking anyway, but I can guide them in some ways that some of these questions can be probed by my students. So an example is, I give the example of radioactivity and nuclear deterrence, which is very, very, very stark in and of itself. The other is I teach mostly undergraduates and masters who are not historians. History does not talk about, IR doesn't talk about empire, right? Colonialism didn't happen. There are theories of state building that really has this giant data sets about 1800s to, I don't know, 2005. And codes infrastructure as positive, as a sign for this is a strong state. Completely, just an example is an actual presentation I was sitting at, and the person codes infrastructure as a sign of strength of state building. But infrastructure was extractive in colonial countries, all right? So that context is completely lost and just thrown out of the window, because the context of power and the context of colonialism does not influence theory building in IR. And that is something that is shocking, but it is the reality. So if we want to decolonize the discipline, we need to think about, as Professor Jalal rightly talked about, ideas. Why are nation states so important, right? That is not the only, how did it become the preferred model of political units, right? What about international organizations, right? The UN really emerged from the League of Nations, and the League of Nations was not really in favor of decolonization. We know that story very well. So I think it's really important to ask those questions in our class, like, why do we talk about hegemony in IR and not empire, right? That the choices we make with language has real implications for the ability to decolonize our minds and the opposition to do it. So I think language is really important. Ideas are really important. Making our students recognize the structures of power in the choice of language and words is really important.
That's wonderful. And then Professor Manjapra, I'm going to build up that question and ask you a little bit of a different one. But when we're looking at decolonizing IR, are we focusing too much on the notions of epistemology or methodology and ignoring the more fundamental issues of ontology? Are the exclusions made at the level of who we are prior to what we know?
Thank you for the question. I believe that there isn't really a catch-22 in the question, because epistemology and ontology are so interrelated in any case. And to step down from what can sound too jargony, what I know the question is asking, what I'm saying is that it's a joint problem. Ontology is just a way of describing what exists. And that's a related problem to the conceptual categories that we use, the quote unquote epistemological categories, to ask questions and analyze problems. In other words, we are facing this problem of how we are limited in IR, but I think it's a more general limitation in academia in general, of in working within particular ways of describing what exists, including who should we be concerned with? What is the nature of their experience? What is their being? And how do we attend to their being? How is their being in relation to other beings? What is its quality? Here we are getting into, I think, a very important interdisciplinary question, or this is where interdisciplinarity is very important, because you can only crack open questions, the limitations of the limits to how we describe what exists, or the limits to our epistemological frameworks, if we are open to working across multiple disciplines. And so, for example, in the conversation that we're having, I think there's a lot of emphasis on the importance of history, because history is about context and history is about relationality. And you cannot understand, kind of the world through these fixed modular methodologies that are often privileged in political science and IR. You could complement the study of history with the study of ethnographies that take us to different scales of understanding. So beyond, let's say, studying groups of people, ethnography may help us to understand family units or individual experience, perhaps, or intimacies that you cannot quite capture sometimes in the archive. And literature takes us even more intimately to study at a more intimate level of analysis. So in other words, it's an interesting question about how do we create different scales of study so that we can study things far, at a kind of aggregate level, but also combine that with the study that takes place at a much more intimate level and everything along the way. I think that's very important and should be pursued. There was one other point I wanted to raise on the issue of the IR curriculum, but it's escaping me. So before I continue, I'll just pause. If you have another question, you can follow up. Sorry.
Sure, I have a question. Maybe this will spark spark thought again. But how does academia help grassroots organizations and organizing directly?
Okay, that's great, because that does relate to what I think I wanted to say. So I just wanted to come back to that theme of organizing, and I wanted to put in a plug to say, as we recognize the university as a social field, as a field of power, like many other fields of power, it is a place where we have to organize for change as opposed to expecting it to come down from above. We should also look at the histories of organizing in the university and study those to understand what we can glean from them, including, you look at the 1960s and the 1970s, or the coming of race and ethnicity departments in that period, and the battles that were being fought, for example, at SFSU, where much of this began in California. Looking at how at that moment, what was happening on campuses was not dissociated from what was happening in Oakland, California, with the Black Panthers and the expansion of medical aid to the community in the face of medical apartheid. So I do believe that forging these kinds of connections or bridges between what's happening in the university in terms of organizing and what's happening in communities is essential. The 1960s and 70s was an important moment, and I personally benefit from what happened then, because it created opportunities that both created new epistemologies and also frankly new positions, like the one that I hold at Tufts. It fits within that lineage. Similarly, today, we are at a moment of unprecedented uprising, and I don't believe that this moment is going to end anytime soon. And so it must be embraced, I believe, but embraced not in a presentist way. I mean, I think if we can forge life-affirming solidarities between university spaces and civic spaces, but also with the understanding of our history of organizing behind us, that is what empowers us and gives us clarity and confidence about the kinds of demands and also the kinds of actions that are needed at this time. Because, how much longer does one have to wait, or should one be expected to wait? Should we be expected to wait at all for certain kinds of essential changes? I mean, I think these are the kinds of questions that students must ask, and faculty in relation, and should be willing to step into the fray and continue to do so. That is how change happens.
Thank you. Professor Jalal, this is a question I've been dying to ask you. We've asked a bunch of the audience questions, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this one. But a lot of your work focuses on identity or around identity. Can you explain what the role of identity is in decolonizing?
Well, I mean, I think identity, I mean, it's not just that my work focuses on identity. I think it also tries to go beyond identity. I think that's extremely important. And yes, I mean, identities are not fixed. Identities are historically specific and shifting. So I think that how that deals, I mean, and your question is how does that, how does it relate to IR? That's your question?
Decolonizing international relations.
Well, exactly. Well, I mean, the point is that, I mean, IR would teach you identity in a particular way. It's something that's solid. It's something tangible. And because IR sees the world in terms of modular forms, unchanging, pretty much, and universal, there is a tendency to create a hierarchy of identities rather than the relationality that I think Chris Manjapra has been talking about, that history tries to teach. So I think there is a tendency to, I mean, the need for decolonization is the presumption that certain identities are superior, others are in this hierarchy, are not as privileged. So I think that's where the decolonization lies, is to really sort of understand identity not as a fixed or as a specific sort of arrangement that's closed in and of itself, but they are all related, we're all interconnected. So I think one of the major things that I think needs to come out of a decolonization of IR is the presumption that identities are fluid and intersectional. And I mean, you know, so that it isn't that there is the West against the rest. And I think there's a big deal about that, talking to people and telling them how they should be. There's this presumption of the universality of certain ideas that need to be imposed on other identities, which are not quite sort of part of the identity that you are trying to project. So I think that I think there is the need is to go beyond identities in any kind of decolonization, to sort of understand our common humanity, however inadequate that might be. But we aspire to be human in different ways. And I think there is a tendency to presume the human as more human in some identities as opposed to others, which I think is just fallacious.
Let me ask a follow-up question, because I agree, and I think everyone else agrees that we do need to move beyond just simple identity. And I think that one of the major ways identities are constructed and changed, and a real big example of their fluidity, but also how they connect people, is the stories we tell around identity and about ourselves, specifically histories. So it's a two-parter, but they both feed into each other. So how are histories written, and why is it important? Why is how histories are written important to decolonization?
Well, extremely important. I mean, I don't think that one would sort of approve of histories that simply repeat the rigidities that we are trying to decolonize. I think that you can write, I mean, there are many kinds of historical writings, but I do think that history makes you aware that many of the things that we take for granted in our presentist world were really sort of really constructed and meant very many different things. Religion is a very favorite category that's constantly touted about, but we rarely ever think about how religion came to be constructed over the centuries and whether at all it has changed. There is this presumption that we all know what we're talking about. We talk a lot about religion, but are we really talking about the same thing? I think history teaches you to question exactly that. What are you talking about? I mean, when you talk about religious conflict, this and religious conflict, that, I mean, you know, when you begin to utilize history to see how religion is constructed and utilized in identity politics, that's when you begin to go beyond those constructs that really enclose you and trap you. So I think that's where history comes in. I mean, you know, there's been a lot of talk about methodologies, but what history for me does, at least, is that it opens up the game in a way that a theory-driven discipline simply does not allow you to do.
Wonderful. Professor Sarkar, so to fail is not tragic, but to be human is. And I think one of the big issues in international relations, but especially in conversations about nuclearization, is actually something that Professor Jalal just brought up, of understanding our common humanity. So how do we understand our common humanity?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, not just an insightful one. How do we understand our common humanity? I think it's extremely important to recognize how almost uniformly vulnerable we are. And this reminds me of a conversation I had in my own classroom in the spring, just when we went online to teach. And I was discussing, obviously, radioactivity and the invisibility therein. And I discussed that, the virus does not discriminate. We're all just as susceptible, just like radiation, right? But at the same time, recognize that there are structural inequalities, that although we are all just as susceptible to the virus and radiation-related illness if we are close to a test site, certain communities are more vulnerable than others, right? So in one way, yes, we are all part of the human spirit, and to recognize that, but at the same time recognize our vulnerability, at the same time recognize in some ways our privilege. And I think I would like to touch upon a little bit about Professor Jalal's use the term intersectionality, and it ties to your earlier question about identities. And I just want to add to that is that I think it's extremely important to recognize, as we are talking about decolonizing IR, that identities are intersectional. And so our identities have different facets. So in certain senses, we might be at the receiving end of power structure, but then not be in a different setting or a different context because it's intersectional. And as a result, in certain contexts, we would be able to recognize the invisibility of the power structure that we are so strongly sensing in that moment in time and space. But at the same time, when we're doing that recognition of invisibility, to recognize the privilege that we might have in other settings. And so be open to other people's identities because every identity, I'm talking in so much abstraction, I apologize. An example is, for example, I work, my first project is on India's nuclear program, the Cold War, and like very, very hyper-masculine topics, right? Attending to that topic, coming to that with my own identity as a woman, as a person of color, as a queer identified person, I can see the structures of power very clearly. I don't see a single woman physicist who is contributing anything to India's nuclear program. I'm sure there are, and technical personnel, they just did not move up, right? That structure is so obvious to me. It is not obvious to, say, another person who recognizes that, the non-proliferation regime is unfair because they're thinking in the status internationalist terms, but it is missing other forms of power within the stories they're telling. So the point I'm trying to make with intersectionality of identity is that we ourselves as scholars, we as ourselves as students, when we're approaching topics, recognize the intersectionality of our own identities that allows us to see invisibility of power structures more easily than others. But we might have our blind spots for privilege that we might have because it's intersectional. To recognize both, to move the conversation forward.
Thank you. We're nearing the end of our time. We have 5 minutes left. So I wanted to ask one last question. I had a question prepared, but I think the conversation has taken a different turn, and one that I'm very grateful for. So both Professor Jalal and Professor Sarkar's comments made me think of Herodotus. He wrote that the point of history is to preserve from decay what humans have been. So that means that it's a story of tragedy and hate and disunity, but also a story of community connection, identity, and triumph. So in this crazy week, in this crazy year, Professor Manjapra, I'll start with you, and then we'll move on to Professor Jalal, and then Professor Sarkar. What are some stories of triumph in decolonization, hopefully in decolonizing IR specifically?
Thank you for the question. I think I have a roundabout way of answering that, which is to, I just want to have maybe my last word be that I think boiling this down to the need for IR to embrace or engage with history is a very important takeaway from our discussion. I would also like to add to that to embrace and engage with the humanities more generally. And the reason why I think that is so important is because, and it's not just about interdisciplinary per se, it's about why we are doing what we are doing in this 21st century. My sense is that this 21st century that we are now deeply in, and I think what has happened in the past 4 years, what has happened in the past 20 years, going back to the turn of this millennium, is all part of a piece. We are living in this epoch, and this epoch is one simply of reckoning. We are living within a period in which, because of climate change, because of political structures, because of economic structures, what has been as a kind of expectation for the way things may be can simply not persist. We will perish, in this 21st century as a global community if things continue in the same way. So just to boil it down, what is needed is reckoning and repair. And my sense is that that is what the humanities offer. They offer the opportunities for ethical reckoning and for repair. And that is precisely what our 21st century is demanding of us. And the question is whether we will rise to meet that demand. It's not a choice. Either we do, or we will have catastrophe. So we're working within the context of catastrophe or possible catastrophe. And so the questions around decolonizing IR and organizing for that change are really urgent, but they're urgent in a way that I would describe as epochal in a certain sense. They are part of these times where we have to shift to reparative approaches of knowledge, and the humanities are needed in order to do that.
Thank you so much. Professor Jalal, same question to you.
Well, I would say that it's, despite intense oppression, the human spirit's indefatigable optimism and resistance. I would celebrate that. I think I wish IR would too, rather than celebrate the structures of power. I think it's the inability of these structures of power that are daily becoming more technical and more sophisticated, that it does not kill the human spirit. I think that in itself is important to recognize, whether it's genocide, whether it's elimination of silencing of people. People cannot be suppressed perpetually. And I think it's that hope that IR needs to reckon with.
Professor Sarkar, final word for you.
Yes, I completely agree with Professor Jalal and Professor Manjapra, and I'm also very hopeful. Just this summer, we saw the statues being pulled down in so many countries. And you raised a question about writing of history and the importance of history. And I think IR might feel, as a discipline, might recognize the need to reckon with history, recognize the complexity and nuance with these pressures from society that we are seeing in place right in front of our eyes. Not for the first time, but it's ongoing. And I think that gives me a lot of hope. In terms of organization, I agree with Professor Manjapra about learning from university organization in the 1960s, but also learn from labor histories in the United States. There is so much that we can learn in this stage where economic inequality is so acute. There's so much to learn from history as individuals, not just as collective and disciplines, that you can do on your own, which I think is a great way to start and continue the process.
I just want to add one thing to that, to say that there is this presumption that history is about the past. And I think one takeaway might be for you to understand that it is a methodology, is how you think. It is not about the past. It is about very much the way you navigate the present and how you navigate the future. So I think that's what is important. But there is this presumption in the IR faculty that we are talking about the past. It's not. We don't talk about the past. We are actually challenging you to think differently in the present.
Wonderful. Anyway, that concludes the panel, DIR 101. Thank you so much, Professor Jalal, Professor Sarkar, Professor Manjapra, to the wonderful audience, especially the people who asked questions. Appreciate you all. This was a wonderful discussion. And now all we have to do is go change the world and decolonize it. Thank you so much.
Take your time.